Hello, and welcome to The Search with Clint and Shahe. My name is Shahe Jurgen, and with me is Clinton DeFrance. We welcome you to this episode as we continue our discussion about the book of Numbers. We hope that you will like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share our content with as many people as you can. We've come to the final section of the book of Numbers today. We've been especially paying attention to the consistent pattern of rebellion that marks the middle section of the book. God had designated the Israelite camp to be holy so that he might dwell in the midst of his people. But what we've noticed is that at every stage, every part of the camp has rebelled in an act of unbelief against God. The tribes rebelled when they refused to take the land as God had instructed them to do. The Levites failed and rebelled against Moses and Aaron, led by Korah. And now even Moses and Aaron themselves have failed in their rebellion against God by striking the rock to draw out water instead of speaking to it as the Lord commanded. Yet, in spite of this pattern of rebellion and unbelief, God was committed to accomplishing his will and his purposes with this people. So, after their 40 years of wilderness wandering had finally come to an end, he brought them up to the plains of Moab, which is a territory on the east side of the Jordan River across from Jericho. And he gave them great victories in Moab, victories over Sihon and Og, these mighty, fearsome opponents. And then, as they encamped in that place, Balak, who was a Moabite king, hired a prophet soothsayer named Balaam to come and to curse the people. But God intervened, fulfilling the promise he made to Abraham centuries earlier, that those who would be blessed, those who blessed Abraham would be blessed, and those who cursed Abraham would be cursed, and that all the families of the earth were to be blessed through him. So those curses which Balaam intended to deliver against the Israelites, God turned them into blessings, fulfilling and renewing the promises he had made, that he was going to give them the land, he was going to give them abundance, and even more. He was going to raise up a powerful and great king from the tribe of Judah who would subjugate all the territories that God had promised to deliver and to hand over to his people. So an amazing scene that unfolded there in Numbers 22, 23, and 24, where God is helping Israel through times of great crisis. Well, we're going to start now in Numbers 25, where, unfortunately, we take another tragic downturn. Let's read the first few verses of Numbers 25 to set the stage here for what exactly is going to transpire. So this is Numbers 25. We'll begin reading in verse 1. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Thus Israel yoked itself to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel. Now, Baal is a Canaanite deity. They often associated Baal as the storm god of the Canaanite pantheon. The name Baal means Lord or owner or possessor. And what we'll learn through later scenes of Israelite history is that when the people of God were worshiping Baal, they were basically at some of their lowest points in all of their history. Clint, what was it about the worship of Baal that was so problematic, so antithetical to what God wanted for his people? And what are some of the common elements that were associated with devotion to Baal?
Well, Baal worship and its associates, Molech worship, or the worship of Asherah, who was the consort of Baal, had common elements that were mostly focused around sexual immorality and self-indulgence, and Molech's worship especially featured human sacrifice, particularly the sacrifice of children. All of this is connected to the very nature of idolatry. Remember that what happened back in Genesis 11 when human beings rejected the knowledge of God and went off in their own way, is explored by the New Testament writers. And I want to notice a passage in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 1, verses 22 through 25, where the Apostle Paul talks about the origin and trajectory of idolatry and human false religion. Romans 1, 22 through 25, talking about those who had walked away from God or turned their backs on the knowledge of God. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So what we see here is that idolatry was born by a rejection of God in favor of something else that was fashioned by human lust and in the image of animal passions and animal urges and impulses. These are the things that lead to what the Apostle Paul called the works of the flesh, things that are utterly antagonistic to the will of God and his reign and rule over the earth and over creation. And so throughout the Bible story, from the Old Testament all the way into the New, we're going to see this connection between idolatry, indulgence in food, and indulgence in sexual promiscuity. In Acts chapter 15, verses 28 through 29, when the apostles and the elders at Jerusalem met to discuss how those who were Gentiles would come into the kingdom of God, we find that they were not going to be bound to follow the law of Moses. That is, they didn't have to become Jews to serve God, but they could not remain pagans. And remaining pagan was summarized by these concepts of eating food that had been offered to idols, things that had been strangled, blood, and fornication. So these activities of self-indulgence, and oftentimes indulgence in a festival that was dedicated to a demon or an evil spirit that brought the eater into fellowship with the evil spirit, and sexual immorality, which was the heart and soul of this whole religious practice. It was born out of a rejection of God in favor of base animal, human passions, and that's what characterized that kind of worship, that kind of religious practice. So that's why we see this continuous connection between fornication and idolatry, or between eating forbidden meat and idolatry. Those practices of indulgence and sexual promiscuity, well, they lay at the very heart of why idolatry existed. It had rejected the reign of God in favor of the reign of human passion.
Very good. That's a very helpful summary. So as this scene unfolds and idolatry and the immorality associated with it begins to occur in the camp, of course, God becomes very upset. And Moses summons all the judges of Israel, and he sort of sends them out into the camp to find the evildoers, to find those who have perverted themselves and gone astray through this idolatrous scene. And then we're introduced to a man I don't believe we've ever met before. His name is Phinehas. He's of the priestly family, the son of Eleazar, who was one of Aaron's sons. And he goes out into the camp, and he finds a couple of people who are engaged in an act of fornication, and he kills them. He throws a spear that pierces through both of the people involved in that act of fornication, and they die. And there was also a plague that was sent out into the camp. And it says that 24,000 people perished as a result of this plague. And it's when Phinehas goes out and finds this couple and kills them that's when the plague finally stops. So, Clint, we're just meeting this man for the first time, but Phinehas will become a reoccurring character in later biblical passages. We'll see him pop up again later in the book of Numbers and then in other places like the book of Joshua. Do you have any insights on this man? Anything we need to know about him?
Excuse me, I was reading the account. There are some details that I was thinking that I recalled about what had happened here as far as this fellow who was, I think, a Simeonite who was lying with the Midianite woman whose name was Cosby, if I recall. And there were some details I was trying to remember that I think were perhaps even more egregious than what we're thinking of. For instance, it says that one of the children of Israel, this is verse 6, came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, in the sight of all the congregation who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And so when he says that he went into the tent, I have understood and actually heard this narrative taught that they were not fornicating in their own tent. They were fornicating in the tabernacle. So it wasn't that Phinehas went out into the camp and he just stumbled across this incident, but that this Simeonite actually brought this woman into the house of God to fornicate with her. Sometimes details of these stories are open to a little bit of interpretation, and it's challenging to catch all of the information. But it looks to me like that's a legitimate point here, that this was not something that was going off in a private dwelling somewhere in the camp of Israel, and Phinehas was wandering around and he heard something suspicious and lifted back the tent flap and saw that somebody was doing something they ought not to do.
Right.
But this was an audacious, brazen act of bringing this temple prostitute into the house of God in order to fornicate with her as a religious act. That's, again, what we have to remember. So Phinehas is full of zeal, the text says, and he takes his javelin and runs it through this man and woman. Among the righteous, there was a hatred of idolatry, and that hatred was appropriate. And, I didn't get into this, but I think it's important for us to remember the biblical picture of idolatry, because we're living in an age when, because of the evils of colonialism, and there certainly were some evils attached with European colonialism, there's an overreaction in our society where we're sort of romanticizing the pagan religions of the indigenous peoples before Christianity came in. And there's this sense, I think, in the minds of a lot of Americans that for instance, the American Indians and people like that had a great life. They lived in a marvelous, peaceful, idyllic, paradisical world before Christianity came in and corrupted them. That's absurd. The American Indians were like the Canaanites. They were a people who had rejected God in the past, and they had a pagan religion that was abusive, that was promiscuous, that was utterly devoid of any value of human life. And a righteous person who knew ethics and morals and who knew the one true God would hate that religion. It has been an act of God in redeeming mankind to take those religions out of the way. And it's a very unfortunate thing to see some people wanting to bring them back and reincorporate them into human life. It'll be a tragedy inasmuch as that occurs. Phinehas knew better. He knew that this is something evil, detestable, wicked, an affront against the Creator of heaven and earth, something that will be destructive to his people. And so, in zeal, he removed it. And he removed it violently, but he removed it because of his love for God. There's a text in Psalm 106 that I want us to read, verses 30 and 31, that talks about what Phinehas did. And there's an interesting statement here. It says, "Then Phinehas stood up and interposed, and the plague was stayed by his action, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness to all generations forever." Now, Our listeners who are Christians and readers of the New Testament will recognize this phrase, "it was reckoned to him for righteousness." It was first used back in Genesis 15 to speak of the justification of Abraham because he believed God. And it's used by the Apostle Paul especially to describe salvation of a sinner, a person who had been a transgressor of God's law and is forgiven, is accounted righteous. Well, here, Phinehas is accounted righteous because he speared two people who were committing fornication. And to the Jews who lived before the time of Christ, this text was used, N.T. Wright has observed, to craft a theology of justification by zealousness or zealotry. And I think that's what we see in the Apostle Paul. Before he became a Christian, when he was Saul of Tarsus, and that's what we knew him as then, I should say, he was zealous toward God and dedicated his life to killing those who he thought were violating God's will. And he thought that his zeal might save him or might justify him before God, we should say. Later, he realized that no, his only hope of justification before God was through pardon of his sins by the blood of Jesus, and that is accounted to those who are faithful. Now, in Phinehas' case, I don't think there's any distinction between zealousness and faithfulness. Phinehas killed these people because of his loyalty to God and his loyalty to God's covenant. But it is possible, and I think later in Jewish thought, zealotry became something different from faithfulness. Zealotry became something that was more couched in human tradition and human wisdom. So it's important for us to understand that this text about Phinehas in Psalm 106 is not presenting an alternative system of justification. You've got justification by faith, and you've also got the option of justification by zealotry. No, Phinehas' zealotry was faith. He did this because of his faith in God and his loyalty to God's covenant, his trust in God's system of things, and this is what he was supposed to do. And it's the same as if we submit ourselves to Jesus Christ. We are emulating the best things about Phinehas. Of course, Jesus did not call us to go out and run a spear through people who are doing detestable things, but rather to go and share the gospel with them so that they might be saved as well. But I think it's very important for us to understand this story. It's a story that is often ignored. I don't know that I've ever heard sermons preached about it, but it was an important story to the Israelites about what it meant to be loyal to God. And so I think it's noteworthy for us to talk about it like this.
And I think we should underscore, to Clint's point, that God commanded this action. We'll talk more about this when we talk about Israelite warfare. In verses 4 and 5, God commands Moses, and then Moses commands the judges, the people, the leaders, to go out and to do this. So this certainly was an act of faithfulness because it was obedience to a direct command of God to make sure that this fornication, this idolatry was put to an end, and a potential defilement of the tabernacle, as you've pointed out. Well, all right, we're going to move on to the next chapter where in Numbers 26, we get the second census, and that makes sense. We talked about this second census as being one of the markers of the book. We're now coming to the conclusion of the 40-year wilderness period. So as was done a generation ago, a census is taken, especially emphasizing the number of fighting men who will be able to go into the promised land to take over the land of Canaan in the name of the Lord. Now, in Numbers 27, after the second census is completed, we have some more new characters, folks we've never met before, and they're named, all 5 of them. There are 5 daughters of a man named Zelophehad. And we learn that Zelophehad was one of those who had died during the wilderness period, and he had left behind no male heirs. He had these 5 daughters who were all of the tribe of Manasseh, And so these women come to Moses with a question. They say, we're getting ready to go in the land. Everything's going to be divided up by tribe, by family. Our father has died. It's just us women left. What's going to happen with us? We want an inheritance in the land too. And so we come to you, Moses, with this petition. Now, Moses, like he often does, doesn't know the answer himself. He goes to the Lord and finds out what the answer will be. And basically, he learns from the Lord that, yes, what these daughters of Zelophehad have requested is right, and they will have an inheritance in the land. They'll have it among their father's brothers, and then they'll pass that on to their descendants. And we're given some additional information about this whole system in the very last chapter. Numbers 36 sort of looks to me like maybe a bit of an addendum that's added to the end of the book to come back to the issue of Zelophehad's daughters in a more generic sense, as to say, here's how the law will deal with women who are going to inherit land. And there are a few stipulations that are required in those circumstances. And one of them is that when a woman inherits land from her father and then she goes to get married, she's only allowed to marry within her tribe. The logistical argument here would be if she marries out to another tribe, then her ancestral land could be inherited by someone from another tribe, and the land was supposed to stay within each tribal boundary. Now, Clint, this is an interesting case study here with Zelophehad's daughters that's then expanded into sort of a more general law code about women who were going to inherit land after the death of their fathers. Do you have any comments about this section?
Yes. You mentioned that the girls are all named. One of them's name is Noah, and I didn't realize that was a unisex name in the ancient world. When I was first studying through this, I sent a little text message to some of my friends, young fellows who were coming along preaching. I said, you need to write a sermon called Noah, a Great Woman of God. It would be very confusing to your audience if they were to see that written up on the board. Teach a sermon on great women of the Bible and make Noah the first one. People will be very perplexed. But in this case, like you said, the incident with the daughters of Zelophehad is a great Old Testament text to show God's love for women and to dispel the myth of a misogynistic God in the Old Testament, a God who hates women and views them like cattle or something worse. This demonstrates God's great affection and concern and compassion for women in a time and a culture where they were not highly valued. God valued them more than the world did. But the passage that you just mentioned, I want us to read it, Numbers 36 and verse 6, and see a New Testament connection that I would suggest, at least, that I think is worth considering. Numbers 36, verse 6 says, "This is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, let them marry whoever they wish, only they must marry within the family of the tribe of their father." As you noted, the purpose of this stipulation was to protect the inheritance from being lost from the tribe of Manasseh. Now, I want us to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and particularly verse 39. The text here is talking about how men and women can serve the Lord, and the Apostle Paul makes the case that a man or a woman who is unmarried can dedicate themselves fully to God and dedicate all of their energies and passions and interests and possessions to the service of the Lord. If you get married, then some of what you have is dedicated to pleasing your spouse and to providing for your family. And that's, of course, the way God intended it. But the point Paul makes is that a single person actually has more opportunities to serve God than a married person. But I want us to look at 1 Corinthians 7:39, where he talks about a woman whose husband dies. He says, "A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, But if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now, the language here is identical to the language of Numbers 36:6. Free to be married to whom she wishes. There's liberty, but there's also a limitation. Only, you might say, within her tribe, which in this case is within the body of Christ, within the family of God. And the reason is the same. If she marries a Christian, then her life, her dedication, her possessions will be, even when they are dedicated to him and spent on him, still shared by the people of God, because he is one of the people of God. If, on the other hand, she should marry an unbeliever, then her inheritance, which God has blessed her with, will be squandered and lost by being dedicated to someone who has no interest in the kingdom of God. So here we see part of the reason why God wishes for his people to marry his people. But the real point that I want to make here is that there is a linguistic connection. There's linguistic identity between the stipulation in Numbers 36:6 and in 1 Corinthians 7:39 that helps us interpret 1 Corinthians 7:39, a text which has been variously interpreted. And how do you evaluate which interpretation is best? Well, one way is by comparing Scripture with Scripture. And, this text about inheritance laws is one that most Christians would probably skip over, and we'd think, this is not relevant to us. But if we did, we would miss this linguistic formula, which seems to be in Paul's mind whenever he writes 1 Corinthians 7:39, and it would hold us back from reaching a clear understanding of what exactly Paul meant.
That is a very helpful reminder, Clint, and such a helpful reminder to be familiar with the language of the Old Testament, because all of the writers of the New Testament were ingrained in terminology, themes, concepts, ideas, even language that was part of what they knew as the Bible, as the Old Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. And so this terminology, this language, these expressions, they were just part and parcel with the way they thought about the world, the way they thought about God, the way they communicated truths. So when we become more familiar with the language and concepts of the Old Testament, it will most certainly help us better identify when parallels are used by the New Testament authors. So that's a very, very helpful reminder and a very interesting connection to 1 Corinthians. Okay, the next part of this chapter, we're still in Numbers 27. The next half, second half of the chapter, is dedicated to the ordination of Joshua. Joshua was God's ordained successor to Moses. Remember, because of the incident in Meribah where Moses struck the rock, he will now be denied entrance to the promised land. So Joshua, who has served as Moses' assistant for years now, will succeed him and will be the one that God has selected to lead the conquest into Canaan. We've talked about the concept of ordination with Israel's elders and judges, at other times with the high priest and the priests in general. And here we have a lot of that very, very similar language and similar ideas found in Joshua's ordination. Let me read a few verses here. This is Numbers 27:18-20. The Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hands upon him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and commission him in their sight. You shall give him some of your authority, so that all the congregation of the Israelites may obey." This ordination, this selection of Joshua is going to be rehearsed again in Deuteronomy. And then when we open up the book of Joshua, which comes after Deuteronomy, we see God speaking directly to Joshua, saying, "I'm going to be with you just as I was with Moses. Be strong, be courageous, and take these people into the land that I've promised to give to them." Clint, we have another ordination here. It looks very similar to some of the others we've seen. Any thoughts about Joshua being commissioned in this way?
Well, it's been heavy on my mind lately. I've been involved in helping some congregations think through the ordination of elders, and it's just striking to me how this formula of election, facilitation, candidacy, and witnesses is so consistent. Here again, God is the elector. He made the decision who Moses' successor would be. He made this time specifically by naming a person rather than giving qualifications. Moses is the facilitator. Joshua, the candidate, is brought before the people. His qualifications are stated. He is a man in whom is the Spirit. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 9, which talks about this same incident, clarifies and says, in him was the spirit of wisdom. It doesn't necessarily mean he was a miracle worker, but he was a man gifted with administrative abilities by the Spirit of God in him, perhaps naturally and perhaps even supernaturally in some respects, but he was a man in whom was the spirit of wisdom. He'd be a good leader, and he was appointed to the office and received Moses' authority by the laying on of hands. So this model is consistent. It's very much noteworthy. I think that we need to train ourselves not to be dismissive of things and think, well, that was just an ancient custom among them, but especially when we see continuity and consistency, we should realize this seems to be something that has its origins with God more than with men, or at least something that God appropriated because it seemed good to him, something that would have a meaningful purpose in the lives of his people. So I think it's good to note the model, the pattern of ordination that we see here, consistent as it always has been.
Yeah, very good. Very good. I agree. I agree. We should see those patterns develop and grow and see them how they play out in different scenarios. And when we see those consistencies in varying offices that are under consideration or varying circumstances. Here, Moses hasn't even died yet. This is happening as a anticipatory transition for when Moses will die and Joshua will take the reins of leadership. So those consistent markers, I think, are so important, and appreciate you making those observations and noting those four elements in the ordination process. All right, so the next couple of chapters are sort of like chapters we've seen before, where certain elements of previous laws that were first given in Exodus or Leviticus are repeated and expanded. We have noticed now these just sort of absolute crisis situations throughout the middle section of Numbers, yet God's unfailing repetition that he will bring this people into the land. So in spite of their failings, in spite of their shortcomings, God is going to bring them into the land. And when they get there, and when they settle, and when the boundary lines are drawn, and the people take their inheritance, they're going to need to be reminded of some things that will remain their consistent obligations before the Lord. And that's what Numbers 28 and 29 are all about. We have laid out in a very meticulous and methodical way the daily, weekly, monthly, and the annual offerings that will be consistently offered at the tabernacle in association with daily and weekly sacrifices, monthly sacrifices, and then those feasts. We've talked a little bit about the feasts. You have the Feast of Passover, the unleavened bread, and the Feast of Booths or tents, and the Feast of Trumpets, and all of these significant days which sort of dot the Israelite calendar. So these sacrifices are rehearsed again as a reminder, when you get to the land, here are going to be things that you will need to remember as part of your religious devotion and dedication to the Lord. Clint, any thought about these monumental lists of sacrifices and what the Israelites will be expected to do once they get to Canaan?
Just to bolster the observation that you have made, that the placement of these lists here is to emphasize, God's faithfulness and God's endurance in bringing to pass his commitments to the people, is that the festivals were agriculturally oriented. At least the majority of them were. They were based on planting and cultivating and harvesting crops. That could be easily missed by us because we don't have agriculturally oriented religious practices as Christians. And that's because the Christian faith is not tied to a land, to a particular territory. And the Jewish faith was. That was very much a part of God's covenant with Abraham. I will give to you this land, and you and your people will live there. And their connection to the land, their dependence on the land, their participation in the land's fruitfulness was an integral part of their participation in the covenant. So it's important for us to recognize the fact that a restatement of these instructions would very much be conditioned on the people settling down permanently in a place where they were going to be planting and raising and harvesting crops.
Yeah, that's very good. And we see, sometimes you think, well, why are certain laws repeated and why are sometimes they reframed or reworded? Sometimes we've noted that it's because of a new set of circumstances. Here, it's because of a new generation. Sometimes it's because God is sort of, making adjustments to things based on the people and he's accommodating them under certain circumstances. So we're going to see that more in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy will look back to a lot of the legal code from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and sometimes just repeat it word for word. Sometimes there might be slight modifications or embellishments and additions to previous rules and laws that were set before. And it's important to look at all of the passages that might deal with one issue or another so that we can get a full orb view of what Torah was actually instructing for the Israelites. Okay, now we're coming to Numbers 31. And this is a particularly difficult passage. Now, it starts, I think, easy enough to understand. It starts as a continuation from Numbers 25, which was the first chapter we discussed with the worship of Baal of Peor and the Midianite and Moabite plan to seduce the Israelites into idolatry and fornication and all of the immorality that was associated with the worship of Baal. At the end of Numbers 25, God says, you're going to destroy the Midianites for this. And God declares that to be his judgment upon the Midianites for what they have done. Numbers 31 resumes that idea with this command from the Lord. Let's read the first few verses. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the Israelites on the Midianites. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people. So Moses said to the people, arm some of your number for the war, so that they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. You shall send 1,000 from each of the tribes of Israel to the war. Now, Clint, this brings up sort of a sample of something we're going to see even more in the book of Deuteronomy. We've already seen occasions where God commissioned Israel to go and to fight. We saw the defeat of Sihon and Og. But generally speaking, in those encounters, the enemies were the aggressors, and God would then send his people out to defeat them. Sometimes God was just trying to get the Israelites around those territories, but the people who lived there refused to let them go around or go through, and so they came up against them. Or we might think of the Amalekites who attacked Israel after they came out of Egypt and were on their way to Sinai. But here we have, in response to the immorality that the Midianites brought into the camp of Israel, God's command to make war against the Midianites and to destroy them. As we read this chapter, we're going to see God wants Moses and the Israelites to wipe them out, and they're going to take bounty from this war. They're going to take plunder. They're even going to take slaves from among the Midianites. And this becomes one of those parts of the Old Testament that is very disturbing to a lot of people, that there are times when God will command Israel to utterly annihilate an entire city or an entire people group, to take prisoners of war, to enslave people from other places and from other tribal groups. And it's a disturbing thing for us to think about in, a very sort of opulent, refined, non-militaristic lifestyle that most of us live, to think about the brutalities of warfare, and that God would actually command people to do this. But we have to remember the purpose of what we might call holy war, or wars that are commanded by God. And it goes all the way back to something God said to Abraham way back in Genesis 15. This is the theological basis for all of the battles that we're going to see take place in the next several books of the Bible. God had granted the Canaanites a period of time to turn back to him. This is what the Lord said to Abram. He had granted the Canaanites a period of time to remember the God of heaven, to remember the one true creator of heaven and earth, to turn away from their wickedness, from their immorality, from their idolatry, from their injustice, and to once again, as all humans had done in previous eras, serve God and God alone. And at the end of that period of time that God had granted the Canaanites, he declared that he would bring judgment upon them. Sometimes the judgment of God came in the form of a flood, or in the form of fire and brimstone raining down from heaven, like with Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of plain. But sometimes God's judgment will come through his instrument, the nation Israel, whom he commanded to go and to make war and to avenge and execute those who were practicing evil. And one thing that I like to remember, Clint, because sometimes I too get uncomfortable reading these passages, is something that we'll encounter when we get to the end of Deuteronomy. When God says to Israel through Moses, I'm going to do to you exactly what I'm commanding to be done to the Canaanites if you start to live like them. You know, sometimes we get into the thinking that maybe God was ethnically prejudiced against these certain people groups, and that he favored Israel in some way that made him sort of this ethnically biased against other people groups. But no, on the contrary, it has nothing to do with ethnicity or place of origin. It has to do with whether or not people were devoted to the Lord. And when the Israelites would later abandon God in their own history, he would do exactly to them what he had commanded to be done to the Canaanites when he sent them into exile and their land was destroyed. So yes, Numbers 31 is one of those chapters that when we read it, it might make us uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable to think about the people of God doing this. But we have to remember the theological premise behind what God is doing here. This was not some capricious act of barbarism. This was an act of divine judgment from God on a people who had just seduced his people into all manner of licentiousness and immorality and idolatry. Do you have any thoughts about any of this, Clint?
Yeah, without restating what you said so well, and I think is exactly right, I would just remind us of a few things. We did not mention earlier in this episode, we intended to, but we forgot, that the fornication and idolatry that was practiced at Baal Peor was instigated by Balaam. We found him failing to do what Balak had hired him to do, but it turns out that he did get his money. He wasn't able to curse Israel the way Balak had originally intended, but he taught Balak to put a stumbling block in front of Israel. That's referenced in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 14. And we learn here about Balaam's role in all of this because Balaam actually is killed in this battle in Numbers chapter 31 verse 8. It says that they killed Balaam and took vengeance on him. So this is still that same plot against God's purposes and against God's people. These people had aggressed against God, but I think that it's so important to remember what you said about God's long-suffering and patience toward them. That's not only stated in Genesis 15, but it's stated in Genesis 9. Remember when Noah made a prophecy of the unfolding of the future through his sons, one of those prophecies was, "Cursed be Canaan." Why? Because Canaan was going to be a depraved and immoral man, and he was going to father a depraved and immoral people. And there had been a prediction of the kind of suffering and humiliation that God would bring against Canaan, and an explanation of why. This was over 1,000 years before these events in Numbers took place. So God had given ample prophetic warning to these people, not just patience, but prophetic warning with the forefathers of their tribe and their nation. And they had rejected it. They had ignored it. They had instead turned away from God and embraced further and further manifestations of rebelliousness against him. And we started out with a discussion of Romans 1. Romans 1 continues by expressing how as men move away from God, God moves away from them. And first, he gives them up to do the things that they want to do that are wrong. Then he withdraws his prophets from them, and he withdraws his warnings from them. And finally, when they move so far away from him that their lives are filled with manifestations of an utter rejection of God's will, then God allows them to, as it were, collapse in on themselves like a dying star.
Yeah.
Their depravity becomes the means of their undoing by the fact that they become repulsive to the earth and to the world around them. When Sodom was destroyed, the whole world was praying for their destruction. Even the heathens were praying that God would destroy them. God says that. I hear the cry of the whole earth against this city. Nobody wept when Midian was destroyed because they were such an evil and obscene and wicked people. So it's very important for us to understand, as you've said, that punishment and annihilation actually plays a significant role in the Bible story. Remember, the Bible opens with the narrative of creation, then the narrative of corruption, then the narrative of correction, and finally the narrative of completion. Well, we're in the correction stage here. God is at work restoring his creation from the corruptions of sin, and that restoration comes through salvation and destruction. It's very important to remember what you said, that this applied to Israel as much as any other people. When John the Baptist came on the scene in Matthew chapter 3, he said when Messiah comes, he's coming with the Holy Spirit, but also with fire. He's coming with blessings, but also with judgment. Blessings to those who believe, judgment to those who reject him. And when Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, he said, "These are the days of vengeance," the very same term used to describe what was happening to the Gentiles here on this occasion. So this is such a fundamental component of the Bible story. God is redeeming his creation, but that which will not be redeemed will be destroyed.
Powerful stuff, and appreciate your comments on that. So, all right, let's go kind of wrap up now the last few chapters, and then after I sort of just explain what's the content last few chapters, I'll turn over to Clint for final comments on these chapters and maybe any other final comment he has on the book of Numbers in general. So after the war with the Midianites, we come to Numbers 32. And in Numbers 32, we have a scene where a few of the tribes, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, come to Moses. And they have a request, and their request essentially is, we've been over here on the east side of the Jordan, what's sometimes called the Transjordan, for a while now. We've been fighting against the Amorites and those of Bashan and the Midianites. We've pretty well subdued all the major forces and players on this side. And, this is a great-looking land. There's plenty of space for our herds, plenty of space to build some homes and to raise up some farms, some crops. We'd kind of like to stay over here. Now, this was not God's original plan. The land of Canaan on the west side of the Jordan was supposed to be the land where the children of Israel dwelled. So again, Moses takes us before the Lord, and they sort of come to an agreement. Moses essentially says, you know what? Yes, it will be fine for you all to stay over here, but there is a major stipulation that you must meet before we can agree on you remaining on this side of the river. Let me read what that stipulation was. This is Numbers 32, verses 20 to 24. Moses said to them, if you do this, if you take up arms to go before the Lord for the war, that's the war west of the Jordan, and all those of you who bear arms cross the Jordan before the Lord until he's driven out his enemies from before him and the land is subdued before the Lord, then after that you may return and be free of obligation to the Lord and to Israel. And this land shall be your possession before the Lord. But if you do not do this, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. Build towns for your little ones and folds for your flocks, but do what you have promised. Later, we'll see when Joshua takes over that he'll come to these tribes and he'll say, remember what you promised Moses. You've got to go with us and to help us to win the war west of the Jordan. So these tribes agreed to these terms. And I'm sure that they will remember the warning of Moses. If you don't, that's a sin against the Lord, and your sin will find you out. It will be known, both to us and to God, that you failed to keep your promise and to help with taking the land that God has in store for his people. So this was a very serious commitment that these tribes were making to cross over and to fight and to win the war before they return to the Transjordan and settle in their land. And we find in the book of Joshua that they do keep this promise and follow with Joshua through the Jordan River and into battle on the west side. Well, now that these tribes have sort of taken stake in this side of the river, what we have in Numbers 33 and 34 is sort of a rehearsal of the wilderness journey. We're going to get this again in the early chapters of Deuteronomy. And the boundary lines are then narrated as to how the land will be divided up once they cross over. So again, all of this anticipation language that we know God's going to give this to us, we know he's going to do for us what he's promised, and we're going over in faith. This new generation has the confidence that the Exodus generation lacked, that God will do for them what he has promised. Finally, in Numbers 35, and we're not going to talk too much about this today, we'll come back to it when we get into Deuteronomy. We have the cities that are going to be dedicated for the Levites named, but also then a number of cities that are referred to as the cities of refuge. And their purpose will become even more evident in later biblical passages. These were cities that were dedicated for special circumstances that an Israelite might find himself or herself in, where they need to go to a city for safe haven so that some judicial matter can be resolved. And these were specially designated cities where Israelites could go and await that judicial resolution from either the verdict of an elder or maybe something from the high priest, or even for a season of life to pass, like the death of the high priest, before something might happen concerning their situation. So we'll talk about what those circumstances were and how that sort of played out maybe in future discussions. So Clint, this brings us to the end of the book of Numbers. We've got the 2.5 tribes on the east side, the boundary lines, the cities of the Levites, and the cities of refuge, and all that we've seen play out in the lengthy narrative sections of this book, some of which will be, sort of recounted in Deuteronomy. What are your sort of takeaways, your final thoughts as we conclude our search through Numbers?
Well, Numbers is such a surprising book. And I think the little blurb you put on one of the videos early on is that the name sets it up to be kind of boring. And of course, the opening material is a census, and that kind of sounds a little boring as well, but that this book has proven to be one of the most demanding and rigorous and in some ways, one of the richest books we've considered so far in all of the Pentateuch. I don't want to make it a competition because nobody would win. All of the books have a vital role. The book of Deuteronomy is going to be an amazing book, very important book when we get to that one next. But as we've said a few times, Numbers is so rich with typology and with historically significant events that not only build upon biblical themes, but establish biblical themes that are going to be integral to the Bible story all the way up to the life and ministry of Jesus and to the purpose and mission of the church. I just don't think that we could overstate the value of this book for Bible readers, and I hope that our study has encouraged people not to judge a book by its cover.
Or by its title.
Its Greek title. That, in fact, this book is a real treasure, and I've enjoyed and benefited from our study a great deal.
I have as well. I mean, obviously, you and I, we've talked about the Torah over the years. We've studied parts of the Torah together in various circumstances. We think of Genesis, of course, as this incredibly unique book, and Exodus with the plagues and Mount Sinai. And it seems like for maybe a lot of Bible readers, myself included at earlier stages of my life, that's sort of where you kind of fall off. And the second half of Exodus is not as interesting. Leviticus is scary and weird, and Numbers maybe is kind of boring, and who knows what's going on in Deuteronomy. And I have felt the same as you, that I have really learned things from especially Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers that I've not really considered much before, or maybe I've only considered in passing. And to think about, for example, how God was working in spite of Israel, and God was accomplishing his will in spite of even the people we should think of as the superstars, like Moses and Aaron, even in spite of their shortcomings and their failures. I mean, we go way back to Exodus when Moses initially refuses to go. He doesn't even want to go. And the whole reason Aaron's given is because Moses doesn't feel like he's up for the task. And so even from that moment onward, God is working through people who are resisting, who are failing, who are sometimes even rebelling. And yes, there are times where God comes down in judgment upon his people, but always in a way that is meant to push the narrative forward and to make sure that in future scenes and stages of biblical history, God's will is going to be accomplished. These people are going to get to the land. These sacrifices at the tabernacle are going to be performed. God's name is going to be made known among the Gentiles. We're going to meet some of them, like Rahab and Ruth and others who will know the Lord because of what God has done through and for Israel, in spite of Israel at times. So I've enjoyed these discussions immensely, and want to say thank you to all of our viewers and how much we appreciate you in sticking with us. We're going to plan to continue to move forward now into Deuteronomy, where we're going to find even more incredible and challenging themes being presented. So we hope you'll continue to join us as we're searching together. We appreciate you, thank you, love you, and hope to see you again next time. God bless.